issue with Idong 학생? As in, you guys are course shopping this week? Is that right? I'm fine with finishing the class 10 minutes early. That's not an issue. But I just want to make sure that everyone, okay, that's fine. So some of you have said, okay, no worries. Let's go back to the slide. Let's see. If I can do it. Share screen. All right. So here it is. Oh, when does the class end? I'm thinking 6:20. Is that when you guys want to get off and check out the other class? 6:20? Yeah, sure. All right, I'll make sure to get it done in due course. Now, let's get back to this map here. Okay, can everyone see this? Does everyone understand what I'm trying to accomplish here on this map? Let's compare this one to the previous one that we just this. So all I've done was to, there. Place a set of grid cells on top of the 21 layers of maps, right? Can anyone tell me what I'm trying to do here? What am I trying to do here? What does this grid cell do for us? This approach. I think I'm gonna start cold calling some of you because you had valid points before. Dividing the mass in equal size. Yes, Idahe, correct. So, as Idahe 학생 said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a unit of analysis for our empirical exercise, where for every unit, we're able to figure out how many sovereign state changes took place, right? But in order to do that, we want to come up with a unit that is the equal size for every region that we can cover. So what you see here, thank you, Idae. What you see here is you have 10,000 grid cells that's placed on top of the European continent. And for every grid cell that you see, we're able to extract information on how many sovereign state changes took place. Isn't that pretty neat? That's pretty cool. So I like this exercise. Yeah. You can do the similar exercise by expanding, increasing the number of cells like 20,000 or 5,000, doesn't really matter. But I took 10,000 grid cells and then I did an exercise. Okay. So restrict to grids that have landmass. Southern border not constant creates consistent units. Again, the important key here is that we want to create consistent units that are equally sized for that cover all the land mass in Europe, right? Okay, and then summary stats. And this is something that's interesting too. So our outcome variable is GDP per capita, right? So we're trying to understand what explains income divergence, the variation in income across Europe. And if you can calculate the GDP per capita for every grid cell, then you can present this kind of map where the gradation of color will give you indication of how poor or how rich certain countries are. So as you expect, eastern part of Europe is not as prosperous as the western part of Europe, right? And you can see that on this map. Any questions about what we're trying to do here? Okay. let's talk about mean state duration. So mean state duration was something that I referred to as our main independent variable. So this is going to capture how many state sovereign state turnovers a particular grid cell experienced conditioned upon the actual centuries, no, number of centuries where there was some sort of state rule, right? Okay. So this is the number of centuries rule divided by 20 centuries. So this is the proportion, the fraction of time over 20 century period for which the grid cell was occupied by some state multiplied by 1 over the number of state changes that the grid cell experienced. Okay, so this is a composite term product that's going to give some indication for what mean state duration is. Any question about the equation, the formula here? Okay, so this is a mean state duration spread when you plot it out. That's also pretty, although if you look at it, it doesn't perfectly correlate with the income spread, does it? Right? So Italy, for example, did not have a lot, some a lot here. So mean state duration, lower than mean state duration means what? There are more frequent turnovers, yeah? Because it's the mean state duration. So the longer state duration means there is more longevity of the same sovereign state that govern over the same place for an extended period. So northern part of France, for example, experienced very few sovereign state changes, whereas parts of Italy, for example, had high turnovers. This was the case in Romania, for example. So if you do the empirical exercise, controlling for all these other things, which I'm going to skip over. Again, these are not terribly relevant for this class, but if you're thinking about different confounding variables that could also explain why income divergence happens, then some of these will make sense to you, right? So you control for all these other confounding channels, and then you still come up with some significance that's attributed to the mean state duration variable, okay? Just to give you some interesting summary stats, what we find is that the lowest number of sovereign states ruling in a region was 1, and the highest number was 12. I think 1 was found somewhere in Denmark. I can't remember. So this means that when, in the past 2,000 years, when there was sovereign state in rule, in places Denmark, there was that single sovereign state that ruled over that region for the entire period. So there was no turnover at all. The highest number, I think, was in Romania and parts of Italy. So you had, in over the 20 centuries, 12 turnovers. That's pretty frequent, right? That's almost like every, one turnover for each, less than 2 centuries. So that's pretty frequent, right? On average, a grid cell region was ruled by about 5 different sovereign states over the entire time period, and had about 4 centuries when it was not governed by any sovereign state. This is kind of interesting, yeah? Because on this day and age, especially in Europe, you cannot imagine any part of land not being claimed by any sovereign state, right? Every parcel of land today is claimed by some sovereign state in Europe. Actually, pretty much all the corners of the world. But remember that we're looking at this from a historical perspective where we're looking at 2,000 years of history, right? So especially in the earlier periods, you would have extended centuries where no single governing authority of sovereign state would be strong enough to extend its dominion over a particular region in Europe, right? So what we do find is that certain regions had about 4 centuries, 400 years, where it was not ruled by any sovereign state. Yeah, I know, right? It's unthinkable now because, real estate's super expensive. Yeah, Korea, Seoul, super expensive. kind of like that. But again, it was not claimed by any land. I mean, there are certainly people living there, so you'd have like autonomous tribes of people, but it was not claimed by sovereign state. Okay, so what are the main findings? Yeah, we have mean state duration having a nonlinear statistically significant effect on 2010 GDP per capita. All things equal, GDP per capita increases with the mean state duration up until 0.3, then decreases. So that's what I mean by nonlinear. It's not always going up. It's going up to a certain extent and it goes down. Yeah. I'm gonna skip this. So this is what nonlinear relationship looks like, just in case you're curious, right? So it's not linear, it's not downward sloping all the time, it's not upward sloping all the time, but it's curved, right? It's like there's a hump. Okay. And then this is the marginal effect of mean state duration. You guys should know what marginal effect is. I mean, this is microeconomics class. I'm sure you've seen this term before. And then I'm going to also skip some of these other things that are just further robustness checks. Allow me to go over this graph before we move on to the next paper. So this one shows you how you can manipulate the data set that is created for this exercise. Remember how I said I'm going to look at how many state turnovers each grid cell experienced over the span of 2,000 years, right? So it's 0 AD to 2000 AD, 21 centuries in total. But what you can also do is, well, if someone criticizes this exercise and say, well, the kind of non-linear relationship that you find in your empirics can be purely driven by the fact that you chose a particular time frame. So just because you find a nonlinear relationship that's statistically significant within that time span of 2,000 years, it does not mean that the same relationship will hold if you cut down the time span to, like, say, 500 years, in the past 500 years, or 0 to 600 AD, or so forth. So one of the things that you can do, and this is what we did, is to play around with the cutoff periods, right? So here, in the first corner, the first upper left corner, you see the relationship, but we only do the same exercise for 100 years, from 1900 to 2000. And then you can do the same thing from 800 to 2000, 1800 to 2000, 1700 to 2000, 1600, 15, 14, 13, and so forth. So I think you get the idea, right? You're increasing the time span from the most current period, and then you're increasing the time span by each time by a century, and you're doing the same exercise all the way back to 100 AD. So here, at this point, you have 20 centuries instead of 21. So the more expanded time span you're looking at, the more clear you see this non-linear inverse U-shaped relationship emerging, right? But even if you take the time period 14 to 2000, which is only 6 centuries as opposed to 20, you still see that non-linear inverse U-curve shape, right? So this shows you that this relationship that we claim seems to be pretty robust. Doesn't matter which time period cutoff you use, it seems to remain pretty robust, right? Does anyone have a question about what this set of graphs is telling us? Anyone? No? Okay. Yeah. So as conclusion, let's just reiterate what we've learned from this paper. State turnovers have an inverse U-shaped relationship with economic development in the long run. There are challenges that remain, as in other long-run arguments that are prone to criticisms. So let me ask you what your criticism might be. When you look at this kind of finding, do you have any inkling of a criticism? Like, do you say, well, yeah, okay, so I get it, but what about this? So what is that? What is something that's bothering you? Could be bothering you. I mean, if you have this inquisitive, critical mind, then you should already be thinking about, well, yeah, professor said this, but I don't quite get it because under different contexts, for example, this may not necessarily hold. So does anyone have anything to criticize about the findings? Or questions? Is this like crystal clear? You think this is perfectly defendable claim that has been rigorously empirically tested upon and you have nothing to add to the literature? But one of the things that I would say I acknowledge as the author of this paper is limiting. Okay, we have something. Maybe you don't know what's familiar. Yeah, Yimhyun, you were right. So can you think of a region that's comparable in terms of land mass, like the size of the land is comparable to Europe, but it had walked along a very different course of history in terms of sovereign state, the way it's been governed, the size of the entity, and so forth? What is the obvious kind of a testing case that could potentially refute the argument that's been proposed here and tested? Pick a region in the world that you think, well, this region of the world might tell us a very different story. Yeah. So I think China, or Asia, but China in particular, will be very interesting. So Idai has also mentioned Africa. Africa is also fascinating, but it's much larger than Europe. And the type of, so one thing that I'm a bit skeptical about Africa would be that the pre-colonial institutions, so this is before the scramble for Africa when all the Western powers colonized Africa and split them into different colonial states. The type of institutions or kingdoms, with few exceptions like the ones in Ethiopia and the Ashanti Kingdom, for example, there are few. There are prominent kingdoms scattered throughout, but you don't see as much in the present. The prevalence of sovereign states is similar in the form or level of sophistication as in other continents. They were mostly like tribal people, right? And this might be like grossly generalizing. So I'm hesitant to say that there were no sophisticated society because that's certainly not the case. And there are different kingdoms that are very strong and prominent. But if you're trying to do this the kind of exercise that we have here, one of the challenges is that there's just not a lot of data for the case of Africa in terms of the type of sovereign state boundaries. This delineation of clear boundary territorial borders, for example, was something that is very difficult to trace in the case of Africa, especially when you're trying to do this over different periods in time. So I've seen cases. There's been research done by Stelios Mikopoulos at Brown University. So he's done a lot of work on Africa and pre-colonial societies of Africa. And he traced different boundaries for different societies who are kind of sophisticated hierarchical societies at the if not kingdom level, at least chiefdom level. But the problem there is it's extremely difficult to trace those kind of boundary changes over time for Africa. So Africa, definitely doable if you are able to put your mind and heart into it for years, but having seen that effort done so far. I think the most obvious go-to option for now would be China. Yeah. So China is interesting because, as probably all of you know, I mean, it's been ruled for a very long time by a single dynasty, at least the China proper, which is much smaller than what we say as China today. The boundaries were much smaller. I didn't include Mongolia or Tibet, for example, or Xinjiang. But China proper has been ruled by a single dynasty continuously up to a certain period, and then it was, for a while, you'd have like a warring states period, but then you have another single period. So there's noticeably far fewer sovereign state changes in China, right? And it was ruled by a massive, like a dynastic kingdom or empire, I suppose. But the landmass that it occupied was also giant, right? So it's comparable to Europe in many ways, and it potentially gives you a very good counterexample to what we're arguing here, which is that if you have lots of frequent turnovers, up to a certain point it's good, but if it's too frequent, then it's bad. Now, can we do the same exercise for China? Yes, because they're having different maps tracing the boundaries of dynasties in China. But that empirical exercise has not been done as far as I know. So that would be a useful testing case for this paper. Okay. Any other comments or questions about this paper before we move on? Yeah. Let's speak about the quadratic relationship. Not reverse. U relation. Is it okay for the trust to? Thank you, Chabyama. That's a very good question. Yeah, you're right. So 1700 to 2000, 1500 to 2000. So this was a time period when you have a lot of different kind of what you call it. So the way that I would explain this is that beginning from 1500, the size and sovereign state changes in their nature were very different from the previous period. So 1500 is the beginning of colonial venture of the Western powers to the New World, right? It was also the beginning of what we see as democratic institutional development. It was also the beginning of a lot of technological advances. So there are lots of different intervening factors that governed, that controlled economic performance other than just these sovereign state changes, right? So all we are trying to do here is that there is this factor that would be able to explain the overall long-term economic performance, but from the 500 years, the recent 500 years, this claim may not hold as well. So you're right. Yeah. So this is like a more long-term story where the beginning of the period from 0 AD to say up to 1500, if you do that exercise, which we did, it's perfect. Not perfect, but it's very non-linear inverse U-shaped relationship. But as I said, there are so many other intervening factors beginning from 1500 onwards that could explain the economic outcome today. So those are probably a lot more paramount in the last 5 centuries. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Right, so that's it for the long-term argument. Now, I'm going to talk about a series of 3 papers that I've also published in recent periods. And I think we have enough time. We might be actually ending a bit early today. I don't know. But before I go on to these, let me kind of quickly summarize what we've done so far. So in the first 2 papers in dealing with the Neolithic Revolution, I wanted to introduce you to the concept of what it means to try to delve into the origin of institutional and economic divergence. So by pursuing that inquiry, we went all the way generations or millennia back to the Neolithic Revolution, right? And then we covered the first 2 papers. But then I also told you about the limitations of making those grand claims, where if you are tracing the channels over 10,000 years, it's just very difficult to defend your argument against so many other confounding factors that others will bring upon. So the second kind of empirical exercise is to say, okay, we acknowledge the limitations of doing that kind of exercise. So we're going to shorten the time spent to 2,000 years, which is still a lot. Right? And then we say, okay, well, within 2,000 years, if you have lots of sovereign state changes, then that's going to give you benefit of economic development up to a certain point, but if it becomes too frequent, then it actually it's not good for you. So there's that inverse U curve, except for the fact that 1500 to 2000 years, there's just a lot more things going on, so it's not as simplistic as just determined by sovereign state turnovers. So that's what we've done so far. Now, next what we're going to do is something that's more, I guess, truer to the idea of applied microeconomics, which is it's all about figuring out the incentives and mechanisms and transactions that occur amongst individuals. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to go over 3 papers that are still historically themed, but we're shortening the time period, the time spent to even shorter time period. So the effort here is to make it more compact, to make an argument that is more convincing, because we're not trying to overreach. We're not trying to make grand claims that span over centuries or millennia. But at the same time, there's a common theme running here, which is we're going to focus on a very important aspect of historical trade. So every paper is related to trade around the pivotal historical event. So the first paper that I'm going to tell you is going to be on the Crusades. So Holy Land Crusades. And then the second paper is going to be on Vasco da Gama's voyage, the Portuguese explorer that discovered the circumnavigation route from Portugal down the Horn of Africa to the Indian Ocean. So if you don't know these events, don't worry about it. I'm going to tell you what happened there. And the third one is going to be on the Silk Roads, Chinese Silk Roads, China and Central Asia as well. But first, let's talk about the Holy Land Crusades. Does anyone know what the Holy Land Crusades were? There must be at least one of you who've heard about the Crusades. Okay. Oh, by the way, I told you I'm going to talk about 3 papers. Another way to kind of map out the procession of like these different arguments is that the first paper that's going to talk about the Crusades is going to still talk about Europe. So we're mainly focused on what happened in Europe during the medieval period. The second paper that I'm going to talk about, the Vasco da Gama's voyage, is moving the geographic scope of analysis a bit to the east. So it's not going to be just about Europe, but we're going to be comparing the urbanization divergence between Europe and the Middle East. So we're shifting our focus a bit to the east. And then the third paper that we're going to discuss is going to be on the Silk Roads, right? In the Silk Roads, we're going to talk about the urbanization effects and trade effects in Central Asia and China, right? So you can see how we're slowly moving away from Europe at this point, because part of the exercise here is to also emphasize the fact that, I guess what I want to emphasize upon students is that a lot of the materials in the context that we cover as economists are very Eurocentric, right? So everything, especially when it comes to economic history and development, we see a lot of emphasis on the rise of the West, right? How Europe became the great powers, how the Western powers became industrialized, and there was relatively very little emphasis on other parts of the world who were historically the dominant powers, but it's just that in the last 500 years, the tables have turned. So inevitably, the scholarship that we see today has much disproportionately heavy emphasis on the rise of the West. So one of the ways that I'm trying to contribute to the literature is to make sure that other parts of the world have their fair share of scholarship as well, and to focus scholarship on finding areas that has historical significant outcomes that are not purely focused on Europe. So that's why you'll see there's a procession, like a gradual move away from Europe towards areas that are in Asia and so forth. And I'm also working a lot on research that has to do with South Korea. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to have time to explore those materials today because this is just a 3-hour lecture. But if you have any questions about those other papers on my research that are specifically on South Korea, you can also send me an email and then we can talk about it too. Okay. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression there. So who knows anything about the Holy Land Crusades? Anyone? Yeah. Movement towards recovery Jerusalem and establishment of Christian kingdoms. Yes. So this is way before your cultural reference. You probably don't even know about these, but has anyone heard of Indiana Jones, the movie with Harrison Ford? There you are. Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones. Anyone? Has anyone watched the series? Yes. I mean, come on. It's classic. So I think the third series, the third movie from that series, is it the third series? I think so. I mean, it was talking about the. Anyways, so one of the movies in the series talks about the Crusades, right? The Crusades. This was an expedition, like a pilgrimage, for the Christians in the North, Europe, to claim Jerusalem as a rightful kind of site for Christianity, right? So that's, the Crusades. So why does this matter? Because before our paper, there was no empirical assessment of the effect of Crusader mobilization on different outcomes in Europe, and that's why we undertook this assignment, and it was very well received when it came out. So let me talk about it a bit. Okay. Okay. So hold on. So the puzzle is the following. If war made states in the early modern period, what impact did the Crusades have on political development in medieval Europe? Okay. So the Crusades were the largest scale military mobilizations of the medieval period. Okay. State consolidation was beginning in this period. I told you that 1500 was a pivotal moment in history, especially for European powers. Yeah. By 1500, there was the emergence of long-distance trade. European monarchs were relatively, they were getting wealthier, and they were already developing growth-enhancing institutions critical for industrialization and democratic consolidation. Blades and Cheney, they argued that Carolingian feudalism encouraged forms of executive constraint that came to be associated with increased political institutionalization. So what they did, Lisa and Eric, they wrote a paper that argued that this divergence, that this institutional development that was good for economic development in Europe, can trace its roots back to 800 or 900 when Carolingian feudalism was in its existence. So it's not even 1500, but already by 900, this kind of divergence in path was already set in place. A little work in political economy documents the transition from feudalism to modern state structures. So the modern state formation that we know of today for Europe, that was the transitional outcome from feudalism. But that transition has relatively received little scholarship, and that is where the Crusade movement, our argument is that Crusader mobilization was crucial for that transition. Okay. Any question about where we are heading with this? Okay. So who are the Crusaders? The Crusaders were drawn from Europe's arms-bearing class. How were expeditions financed? These expeditions were very expensive, so they were financed by land and other property sales, as well as national poll taxes. What impact did Crusades have on trade and economic integration in Europe? So there was a large-scale simultaneous sale of landed estates, hurting feudal landlords and helping medieval capital holders, encouraging the rise of towns. So what that means is that when these rulers went on crusade expeditions, they had to sell their land because they had to finance their expeditions. And who were able to purchase the land? These were the the wealthy kind of traders who were going to pay handsome amount of money to own the land. So as a result, there was a lot of consolidation of wealth centered around wealthy traders who were more likely to live in towns. So what we find is that there was an increase in urbanization as a result of crusaders going on expeditions and selling their land. In Northwest Europe, which had been relatively economically isolated, became more integrated into Mediterranean trade because these European crusades, when they went back and forth through Mediterranean seas, they carved out trade routes that did not exist before. Okay? Crusaders also brought back a taste for Eastern products, which facilitated the rise of trade and champagne fairs. So there are many different channels through which the Crusades influenced or affected urbanization and trade in medieval Europe during this time period. Does anyone have questions about this? Okay. So think about why we're going over this material, right? I mean, some of you might be interested in Crusade, that's fine. But even for those of you who couldn't care less about Crusades, what you need to understand is that the rise of Europe, which is crucial for understanding where economic theory comes from, because modern kind of economic theory and microeconomic theory in particular, is coming from the foundations of market economy based in Europe. But that market economy can trace its roots back to some of these institutional developments that happened with modern state formation in Europe, right? But those modern state formation were transitioned outcomes from feudalism. And that transition, we're arguing, was helped by the Crusader expeditions. So this is one kind of particular channel that could explain the eventual consequential outcomes that we're studying in a broader sense today. Questions? No? Okay. Elites. Did the Crusades help eliminate elite rivals to the king? So that's a question that we ask in this paper. And the answer is yes, right? Why is that yes? So interestingly, when you have crusades going out to Jerusalem to kill themselves for the sake of devotion to Christianity, you're essentially eliminating your rivals, right? So oftentimes what you have brothers, the younger brother would go out there as a crusade, or the older brother would go out to become the crusade, and as a result, it kind of consolidated powers within. Right, because oftentimes the ones who went out on this expedition would be killed, right? Does anyone have an idea why people went on crusades in the first place? Like if you were an elite, if you're a nobleman in Europe, what motivates you to go on this expensive, probably fatal expedition? For what reward? Why would you do it? It's an important question to ask because economically speaking, how did it benefit you? And yet there are droves, there are bevy of people who went on expeditions to become crusades. For honor. Patriotism. Yeah. I don't know about patriotism because it's not clear whether crusades were something that was mandated or directed at the state level. It was certainly centered around Christianity, right? Hope. So I think honor could be definitely part of it. I think honor, even more than family honor, it's more about your faith, right? Your Christian faith. This idea that you're going to become a martyr for your faith. This was hugely attractive for people in those times. So it's an interesting question because there's just not a lot of literature that talks about the economic motivation or incentive for individuals to go on this very difficult expedition, right? So one of the documents that we found out was, yeah, I mean, most likely people went there because they were devout Christians and they really truly believed that their expedition, claiming Jerusalem as their own, was something that they were doing for God. Right? Without this kind of incentive, it would not have made a lot of sense for people to go on those because it was just not economically making any sense. Okay? So keeping that in mind, elites, if the Crusades, if you went on a crusade and your brother was a competitor to the throne or your land ownership, then this definitely helped to consolidate. Taxes and parliaments was crusade mobilization associated with greater probability of holding a medieval parliament or higher downstream taxation capacity? And the answer to that, we think, is yes. Again, for not only local nobles, not the vassal lords, but also some of the kings, the higher noblemen, they had when they go on expeditions as crusades, they had to mobilize a lot of resources to finance their trips. And one of the ways to do it was to collect more taxes. But in the process of collecting more taxes, you had to concede. You had to make concessions with those who are going to be taxed, right? So this is the classic argument for those with weak power, right? Weak rulers with not a lot of power. When they want to finance or when they want to collect a lot of taxes, they have to, in return, reciprocate by conceding some of their powers down to the vassal lords. And as a result, you see the formation of parliament. Land sales, trade and urbanization. The Crusades encouraged the rise of towns by benefiting capital holders to landholders and encouraging trade and European economic integration. Yes. So that's the answer to that is also yes. Okay. So some of the outcome variables that we're looking at here are ruler duration, existence of medieval parliament, tax revenue, urbanization, and then we have a whole bunch of control variables that I'm not going to go in detail. The key independent variable here is crusade mobilization.